The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, I just want to first of all advise the Honourable Jerry Brownlee to stay in his seat because he otherwise might fall over. I want to congratulate him for this legislation. I can't recall doing that before. I didn't want him to be standing and collapse in shock. This is a really good next step in the recovery, moving from post-quake disaster response to recovery and now to regeneration, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to hear the submissions on this legislation from people of Canterbury, which I think will be generally supportive but raise some concerns in the same way as my colleague Megan Woods just has in her contribution. The bill, from my point of view, has the real opportunity now to speed up activity in the city, and I think everyone would agree that, particularly in relation to the anchor projects, in relation to decisions that have not yet been made about some of the key projects, that has actually slowed down other activity. So I hope that this new body that is formed under this legislation can give some grunt, some commercial rigour and some drive to the investment that we so badly need. The second point I want to make about the legislation is that it finally gives local voices and local leadership. It's been a long time since the September 2010 quake and then the February 2011 quake for us to feel as if somebody else is running our city. In some circumstances it was absolutely needed, but in others I think it wasn't necessary, and we've had those debates in this House and in other places in the past. There's no need to dwell on them now, but I think it's a good restoration of local voices, local leadership, local decision making. The third point I want to make is, I suppose, the area in which I have the most concern, and that's about the special powers that are retained in this legislation. I know that the Minister will need to retain some special powers post-Sarah. It's a delightful expression. Life in Canterbury after Sarah. I'm so looking forward to it. But I'm not convinced that all the powers that are being proposed to be retained by the Minister under this legislation are necessary, and nor am I convinced that the checks and balances that you would assume would be part of giving ministers special powers are contained in this legislation. The words are too high level and not specific enough for my satisfaction. It's the same as was in the Sarah legislation, actually. The minister had special powers which we understood would be needed, but were to be granted if they were in the interests of earthquake recovery. Well, that is too broad, in the same way as regeneration is too broad a term. We need the minister, whoever is holding the portfolio, to be able to be held to account to this Parliament and to the people of Canterbury when exercising special powers. So I think that's a gap that would need to be filled, and actually it wouldn't take much to give more specificity to the regeneration term is one way of doing it, but to make sure that we will have confidence in knowing that when the Minister does use any special powers that this Parliament grants him, that they'll be for the purposes for which they were granted. That has not been the case in recent times. We've seen the use of Section 38 to demolish buildings which were not in the best interests of earthquake recovery, actually. I think the destruction of the Majestic Theatre is an obvious example, but there have been more. Mr Speaker, I want to commend the Transition Advisory Board that was from the outside looking in, because we never got an opportunity to meet them formally, unfortunately, but the Transition Advisory Board was, from all accounts, very competently and ably chaired by Dame Jenny Shipley, former Prime Minister of this House, member of a National Party cabinet. In my view, Dame Jenny conducted the activities of the advisory board in an inclusive way where she listened respectfully but showed no fear at all when driving ahead with what the board agreed was in the best interests of Canterbury, and I think that was a very good thing. And I also want to commend the other members of the Transition Advisory Board. I think they've done a very good job in presenting us with a path on the way forward. I'm not sure that the legislation will be 100% to their satisfaction, and I don't suppose they'd feel they were in a position to make a submission, but I certainly think from reading their commentary to the Minister that the Minister has taken on board in large parts their suggestions and their contributions. I also want to acknowledge our undemocratically appointed Regional Council, but with no offence to the appointed commissioners, because I think they have been playing an active role in preparing this transition plan. Dame Margaret Baisley was a member of the Transition Board, so I want to acknowledge them, and I want to acknowledge our three councils, Waimakariri, Selwyn and Christchurch. The three mayors, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, David Ayres and Kelvin Coe, were all also represented on that Transition Advisory Board. And again, from the outside looking in, it appears that they made very strong contribution and comments on the future of the governance of our city. I want to move on to two opportunities that I think have been missed in this legislation. That is not a criticism of the Minister. I think he's looked at what needed to be done, what the Transition Advisory Board recommended, and has got on with that task. But I would hope that there may be an opportunity during the Select Committee, and I'd really urge the Minister, now that he's recovered from the shock of me congratulating him on the legislation, to consider two opportunities that I think we should grasp at rather than miss, which is the current situation. The first one is in relation to transport as part of the regeneration of our city. We have a model that doesn't work in a post-quake environment to the best that I think we could do. So I would encourage the Minister to look at this legislation as an opportunity to have integrated transport planning for 50 years out, not for 5 years out. You know, what do we need in Canterbury? Where has our population gone? What opportunities are there? And I know the Minister's quite good at transport stuff. He's done a lot of work in a ministerial capacity in that. So he's certainly, you know, the right person to be thinking about that. Possibly better than the current Minister of Transport, but, you know, who am I to compare? So I do think we have an opportunity to look at the integration, to look at the planning, and to look at how that would, how would we, if we had a blank sheet of paper, which we just about have in parts of Christchurch, what would we do in terms of a transport system? So that's the first area that I'd really encourage the Minister to look at. And the second area is one that I think we've missed the boat on almost entirely during the last 5 years, despite the best efforts of many people who are involved in the health system, and that's looking at the long-term psychosocial impacts of the quakes. What happened to families, what happened to residential living, what happened to employment, the grief process, the trauma, the disruption that everyone went through. What does that mean for now, and what will it mean for 10 or 20 years' time? I know that we've got a psychosocial recovery plan, but it's so high level, I don't think it will have any impact on what we need on the ground. I think we need a more specific plan. That's not a criticism of the actual plan, it just doesn't drill down enough. I think we need a more specific plan that looks out particularly at integration of all the different agencies that are involved in touching our citizens who have been impacted on negatively. That includes the health system, of course, but it also includes our housing providers, it includes our education system, it includes all our social service providers. Everyone who touches our citizens should be part of the planning of a detailed psychosocial recovery plan. I think that the pressures in our city are going to remain. We know that as Canterbury members of Parliament, and I don't think they're being recognised in the system. The current exercise that Canterbury District Health Board is being asked to go through is an example of the lack of recognition from the capital towards what impact the quakes have had on our delivery of services and our ability not just to do business as usual, but to meet greatly excessive demands on what we would have formally planned. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude with that commendation again. This is a good step forward. I've got some questions to ask about it. I've got some concerns that I've put on the record. I think there are two areas that we have currently missed an opportunity, but we could remedy that during the Select Committee process. I've looked at the bill, and I'm sure that including transport planning and integration and including psychosocial planning would be within the scope. They're certainly within the regeneration space, and also, of course, looking at making sure that those three concerns that I had, the special powers, the speeding up of activity and the local leadership, are acknowledged during the coming stages. So I'm looking forward to the submissions. I hope that we're able to have a decent length of time to hear them by extending that time out, and commend the progress of this bill.